Hello, and thank you all for joining us today for the second panel. Ce deuxième panel porte sur les questions de coopération globale sur l'environnement, le changement climatique et l'énergie. I'm Campbell Clark. I'm the chief political writer for the Globe and Mail. And we're going to be joined today by these four panelists who've just been introduced. Their biographies are in your program, if you care to look into it further. We have Ed Fast, MP for Abbotsford, Conservative MP for Abbotsford, former Minister of International Trade. Jonathan Wilkinson is the MP for North Vancouver and the Parliamentary Secretary for Environment and Climate Change. Nicolas Chapuis, the Ambassador of France to Canada. And Jean-Arnold Vinois, Energy Advisor for the Jacques Delors Institute, which is a think tank in Europe. So on the question of cooperation on environment and climate change and energy, we've definitely seen a change in December at the Paris COP21 talks on climate change. We saw two organizations that were in tune with each other, and that was different. Canada joined the High Ambition Group during these talks. They were pushing for the kind of agreement that the European Union had been pushing for. The European Union was the group that founded that High Ambition Group, and that was new. This was a tone that had changed from the previous government, and now we have a question of what happens after the treaty and the framework agreement of Paris has been instituted. So to take us through where we are and where we're going, let's start with Mr. Wilkinson, who represents the current government, and tell us where you see where we are right now.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to be here today. It's certainly a great pleasure to be here as we celebrate the 40th anniversary of the signing of the Framework Agreement for Commercial and Economic Cooperation. On a personal level, as somebody whose academic background and training is in international relations, but who also went to university in Europe, I'm very familiar with the importance of the role that's been played by the European Union in the post-World War II era, and of the historic relationship and the very strong ties that exist between Canada and Europe. I think many will know that the focus of the original agreement between European Union and Canada way back in 1976 was on the promotion of commercial and economic cooperation. But around the same time, Canada and the EU also established bilateral cooperation on environmental matters, and that cooperation has continued and it has deepened over time. This year is great to be celebrating what's been accomplished to date, but I think it provides us with an opportunity to reflect a little bit on where do we go from here? How do we broaden and deepen the collaboration between our respective parties for the benefit of both and for the benefit of the broader global community? And there certainly are a number of activities and a number of critical policy files that provide opportunities for us to go forward. And let me just talk a little bit about each one of those. So Canada and the EU, as most of you will know, have for some time been working on the development of a comprehensive economic and trade agreement to facilitate freer trade. That also, though, contained substantive environmental commitments, including commitments to ensuring that domestic environmental laws are effectively enforced. And I would be remiss if I did not note the critical role that my colleague Ed Fast played when he was Minister of International Trade in negotiating that agreement. Secondly, Canada and the EU recently negotiated a strategic partnership agreement, which will deepen and broaden the scope of our bilateral relationship on key foreign policy issues and on related matters. But this also, in the agreement, includes the recognition of the importance of the protection and conservation of the environment and climate change, with a view to sharing best practices. Thirdly, the effective implementation of the Paris Agreement, I think, represents another area in which closer Canada-EU collaboration will be extremely important. Both Canada and the EU played important roles in achieving the agreement at Paris. I think, again, I would be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to thank Ambassador Chapuis for France's leadership and commitment to the success of the Paris Agreement. Beyond strict implementation of the Paris Agreement, again, there are enormous opportunities available to the parties as we think about how we evolve our relationship. So some of these things would involve sharing of best practices and experiences in areas like energy strategy, carbon pricing, and others, facilitating learning and cooperation in the area of clean tech development, which can assist both parties in driving economic growth and reducing GHG emissions, working to develop means by which we assist developing countries to grow in a less carbon-intensive way and to help with adaptation. And working collaboratively in the association with the Arctic Council to ensure that we can effectively manage the impacts of climate change on Arctic peoples and on security issues in the Arctic. Again, beyond the climate file, there are a range of important foreign policy issues that were discussed earlier today, so I won't go into those, but that open up real opportunities for cooperation. Canada and the European Union share much in the way of common history. We share a strong commitment to many common values, including commitments to democratic institutions, human rights, pluralism, multilateralism, and environmental protection and sustainable development. I think there's extremely strong alignment between where the EU is going and where the new government in Canada is going. And so I think this is really an exciting time in the relationship to build and to deepen what we've already started. So I look forward to the conversation today.
Mr. Chapuis, you were involved in preparations for the COP21 by talking to the Canadian government here. There's been 2 governments in your tenure. Now there's a question of, for the Canadian government, implementing these commitments. They have to deal with multiple jurisdictions. They have to change the industrial structure. They have to change the supply of energy within Canada. The European Union has done some of that already. They have member states that are perhaps further along, and they have to deal with the sort of federalism of their own. So what can the EU teach us, and how do you see the cooperation moving together as that kind of work comes along?
Well, I'm not sure if the EU can teach anything, but in terms of global and universal benchmarking, it's been clear, and Jonathan just said it, that the history of our relationship between EU and Canada brings opportunities to do these benchmarks and try to go forward together. The Paris Agreement, looking forward, is the possibility now for every single country, so that includes Canada, and within Canada, all the different levels of jurisdiction, to bring the conversation we had in Paris back home and try to hold that conversation home and try to build the consensus that appeared in Paris. You may remember this time last year, many people were skeptical whether Paris will make a deal. Will it be possible? Would the US be on board? Would the agreement be a binding legal agreement? Would the climate finance be there? All these questions are within the national conversation in Canada, as we observe today. Since Vancouver, when the Prime Minister, in the margins of the Globe Conference, opened his first formal meeting, first with the First Nation and then with the premiers, provincial and territorial premiers, everything was put on the table, even carbon pricing. And so the conversation is happening. And I've noticed that Mrs. McKenna has also opened a platform online to have, if you have an idea on how to do it, please tell us. And this is exactly what we have been doing in Europe for the last 20 years. In fact, we were all disappointed by the failure of Copenhagen, COP19, and we needed to have something that would put us in a position to operate the transition to a new economy, because the fight against climate change, basically, is the transition to an economy less dependent on fossil fuels, more sober in carbon, and that means to bring everybody in this energy transition while doing investments in new technologies. And so in France, if I just take the example of France, but it's true in other countries, we wanted to be a role model before the COP21, so we passed a law, a national law on energy transition. It was difficult. 6 months of parliamentary debate. There were choices, hard choices to be made on nuclear power, on agro-industry, on construction, on standards, and so on. But the law passed with quite an interesting majority. It was not left against right. It was a global conversation, and now the law is now being implemented. So my questions would be, to rebound on the end you just forwarded me, is how Canada is going to be able, with the provinces and territories, to establish that difficult consensus before the end of the year. I understand that the deadline is October. And when I heard your Prime Minister in Vancouver saying that he didn't only want to be part of the fight, he wanted to lead the fight against climate change, this leadership that Canada would bring before the COP22 is very important. And I would just say, as a conclusion, that we are looking forward to what Canada and Europe and Canada and France could do for developing countries, because the Marrakesh COP22 conference will be on Africa, basically. How do you bring electricity with clean power? How do you link the sustainable development goals with the fight against climate change? Because it goes hand to hand. That's what we saw in Paris, and that's why, one of the reasons why there was such a consensus.
So there are certainly opportunities for climate diplomacy there. At the moment, though, Canada and its provinces are still working on a strategy here, but there is no national energy strategy. There is no national climate change plan yet. Mr. Vinois, is there something in Europe that we can take as the pattern?
Well, the pain you may learn from the European Union, because it has taken a long time to develop an energy policy for Europe, and climate change was the driver for coming to an energy strategy. And all this dates back 2007, so it's quite recent if you think that the first treaty linking the member states of the Union was a treaty on steel and coal in 1952. But member states have always been very jealous of their prerogatives in the field of energy. And they have, and the organization was such that having a state-owned monopoly in each country, there was no appetite to open the borders and to work together at the European Union level until 2007, when there has been a major breakthrough where Angela Merkel chaired the European Council at the time with all the member states to decide about an ambitious program, which was the reduction of 20% of CO2 by 2020. Also the promotion of renewables, having 20% of renewables in the energy mix by 2020, and an improvement of energy efficiency of 20% by 2020. This has led since 2007 to a major change in the energy landscape of the European Union. It was also combined with a major step forward in the integration of the market. So the ambition was always, since the 90s, to have a European market for electricity and gas. And until the unbundling of the infrastructure from the supply and distribution of energy, it had not been possible because the vested interests had blocked any change. But since 2007, we have really a major change, because as the infrastructure is a common carrier for gas or for electricity, it has been possible to blend all the gas, whatever the origin of the gas, whether it was Russian, Norwegian, or Algerian, or LNG. And for electricity, it made possible for all the producers of renewable energy to come on the infrastructure and to deliver solar and wind in the system. And the result has been so successful that it has disturbed completely the electricity market. So we have a kind of crisis of the electricity system, but at the same time, we may say that the energy transition has started. Because, for instance, already 25%, 30% of electricity is generated from wind and solar. And energy efficiency has improved a lot. And in gas, I have to say, thanks to the Russian pressure, thanks to Mr. Putin, who decided, you remember, maybe in 2009 to cut the supply of gas to the European Union, we have organized ourselves in such a way that all the pipelines are completely flexible, can go in all directions, west, east, east, west, and so on, to ensure security of supply. So all these things have really meant that energy has jumped to the top level of preoccupation of all the member states. The best evidence is that always the heads of state and government deciding the big orientations in the field of energy since 2007. And of course, the last decision they made was in October 2014 to say we continue this ambitious objective with having a reduction of 40% of CO2 by 2030 and 27% renewables, 27% improvement of energy efficiency, and also having a governance between the member states to ensure that these objectives would be met. And that means particularly, and this is also very relevant for Canada, the ability for each member state to elaborate a long-term vision for energy or a long-term energy strategy, which will at the same time enable the consensus among the member states on the best way to proceed at the European level. So starting with defining the components of the energy strategy at an horizon of, let's say, 20 years, to 2035, is, I think, the way forward. And this is, by the way, a recommendation also of the International Energy Agency to Canada in its last report of last year. So I think that all starts there. And this is the way to proceed, because you have the problem of the provinces in Canada, and in the EU, we have the member states having the sovereignty on the energy mix. In other words, they decide whether they want to go for coal, for nuclear, for gas, for renewables, and so on. But they are completely free to decide that. And in a market which is being integrated, this is creating a number of questions, and some technical questions which are very difficult and which are in debate at the moment on the electricity market design. But so you see, it's a long way to go. It's demanding something which is the support of all the players, and that's very important. And what we have also seen as a change is that the consumer is becoming a key player in the energy system, which was not the case before. Before it was the utilities or the big companies. Today, the consumer is playing a major role, and the consumer is seen even as a fuel, because he may save energy, he may produce energy, and all this is really changing completely the landscape and bringing also a lot of new players in the system.
So the market's been fragmented. There are more suppliers.
Yep.
There are consumers that can switch from one supplier
Absolutely.
to another.
Yep.
And it changes the structure of the market.
Yep.
Now, the Canadian energy market, the European Union's energy market, are far apart and not linked. One of the ways, I suppose, they would be linked is by trade, but through technology, possibly, through environmental goods. Is that something that you see as one of the ways that Canada and the European Union might cooperate in terms of environmental issues?
Certainly. We have a huge opportunity now with CETA in place to increase trade flows between our countries, including the trade in environmental goods. Just about a week ago, I had someone come into my office, a couple of representatives of an NGO, an environmental NGO. We had a very good, frank discussion about some of the challenges facing Canada. And then he said, yeah, but you as trade minister, don't you sense that trade is bad for the environment? That trade actually gets in the way and trips up our ability to make progress on achieving our environmental goals? And I said, actually, quite to the contrary. When I look at what happened within APEC, the 21 countries of APEC, where we decided to get together and come up with a list of 54 environmental goods on which tariffs would be either completely eliminated or almost eliminated. And that morphed into the Environmental Goods Agreement, which is being negotiated amongst a much larger subset of countries, including the European Union, an opportunity for us to eliminate barriers to trade in environmental goods. You also look at things such as, say, something like trade facilitation. That's one of the things that trade agreements do well. They can put in place understandings and disciplines that allow and actually compel the partner countries to facilitate the flow of trade amongst themselves or between them. And let me just give you an example. Canada and the United States, we embarked upon a project, a pilot project, where we would allow American customs officers to inspect goods coming into the port of Prince Rupert. Remember that?
I do.
And it was basically inspected once, twice approved. It was a significant way of advancing trade. But what it did is it cut down dwell times for the trains that are delivering these containers to the American Midwest by what? 1 3/4 hours? Just that alone. One initiative that can actually help us move the yardsticks forward in achieving our environmental goals. Now, having had a chance to actually be in Paris, thank you for the invitation to let me join you there. It was quite an experience, but I think we have to also be very realistic about what happened there. Yes, we have a binding international agreement, but what is not binding are the actual greenhouse gas emission targets that each country has committed to. Canada went there with a set of emissions targets that certainly as a member of the previous government, we believe those were reasonable targets. They're achievable targets, but they're going to be tough to meet. And we certainly believe that they should be maintained. But that said, there's nothing that compels us internationally to actually reach those targets. And we've seen this picture before. We saw Kyoto. You know, there was a lot of oratory language around the agreement, but nothing that bound countries to actually perform on those commitments. And that's why we, you know, especially as developed countries, we have to understand we have an obligation to actually achieve the targets that we've set. And in Canada, that is a real challenge because we have a federal state in which much of the jurisdiction for environmental legislation falls within the purview of the provinces and territories. Fortunately, across the country, we do see a fair consensus developing, even with conservative leaders like Patrick Brown here in Ontario, in Manitoba, Brian Palliser. They have clearly accepted that carbon pricing has to be one of the tools that will be deployed in meeting our greenhouse gas emissions targets. The issue is how will they be deployed? And that's where we can learn from the European Union, because you've had quite a number of years of experience now with a carbon pricing trading regime, the good, the bad, and the ugly, all part of it. We get a chance to learn from that and hopefully not repeat the mistakes of the past. You are our guinea pigs, and we get to learn from that. But there's a full debate happening within Canada on what does carbon pricing look like. I've got my biases, but I don't think I'm going to share them here. But the reality is, somewhere along the line, we have to find a way of making sure that we incent good behavior and we disincent behavior that we want to discourage. And what that will look like going forward is going to require a whole suite of tools. And I'm not sure in Canada we've actually settled upon that yet. We don't have a national climate change plan yet. That was certainly anticipated in Paris. We thought there might be something more concrete coming out of Vancouver. In the fall, we expect the First Ministers to meet again, and we'll wait with bated breath to see what that outcome looks like.
One of the things that governments in Canada now and in Europe promise their citizens is that the climate change transition will be good for the economy and good for jobs. Some of them might not want to be free trading. They might want to create subsidies for their own industry. They might want to encourage production in their local areas that doesn't allow competition from other places. Is that something that the Canadian government is going to have to deal with in ways that are going to be difficult in terms of keeping free trade alive?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, I agree with most of what Ed said. I think that this government, in the same way that the previous government is committed to free trade, I think we understand that the benefits of free trade are related to the ability to actually, bring in the kinds of technologies that perhaps you don't have yourself and to export the ones that you do develop. and that ultimately, the whole idea of comparative advantage actually helps to develop an economy that's going to be more robust. I don't think that you're going to see much in the way of protectionism from this government, but we certainly are going to be looking for means by which we can incent good behavior and disincent bad behavior with respect to pollution, and we are going to be looking for mechanisms by which we can accelerate and foster the development of a Canadian clean tech industry, which is going to be, in our view, one of the big drivers of growth.
Is that subsidies? Is that protection?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, I think it's partly about looking at the chain of development and finding ways in which you can actually help the development of technology. When you're actually getting into commercialization and deployment of technology, you have to be careful about, ensuring that that's open and the procurement processes are fair. But, Canada has some enormous opportunities in the clean tech space. Not everywhere. I mean, there are areas where we clearly benefit from the work that was done in Europe. So Vestas was the one who actually led the way in wind out of Denmark. Europe still continues to lead in wind and many solar-related technologies as well as efficiency. But if you think about technologies around bioenergy or fuel cells or water technology or resource mitigation technologies around carbon capture and all of those kinds of things, Canada has a significant base of expertise and an opportunity to provide the world solutions that actually will benefit economically Canadians.
So if there's a strategic partnership agreement between Canada and the EU that's been initialed, one of the things it says is that the two sides will work on best practices. Best practices presumably for policy that goes beyond making treaties at the COP. It goes into practices in terms of changing our industry, our energy. Is there a particular area for opportunity that we should be looking at there, Mr. Vinois, in terms of exchanging best practices between Canada and the European Union?
Well, I think there are a lot of common interest, and I've looked at these issues. And for instance, we share surely the same objective in terms of diversification of sources of supply for the European Union, and you are looking for diversification of clients. So in other words, there is a clear area where there is room for discussion, because diversification is the key word in the energy policy. And you are full of resources, and at the same time the European Union has declining resources, except renewables, but when we are talking about conventional resources. So Canada has major resources and is interested to exchange them, and I think that's an area where a lot of things are possible. So I'm sure in the field of renewables, which is then clean technologies, we have a lot to share, because you have also some experience in the field of renewable energy, as we have also in Europe, with different features. And I'm sure that it's an area where we may cooperate. Energy efficiency, which is today the first priority of the energy policy, because the best energy is the one you do not use. It's an area where a lot of things are happening at the moment, and not least on demand-side management, which is what I said about the consumers. The consumers now is empowered, and it is very important to help him to save energy. And this may be done particularly with digital services, which are coming strongly. Well, I would say US is probably stronger in this area because we are speaking about the Google and others. But I think that we see a lot of startups working in this field. If you think that 30% of energy can be saved by just empowering the consumer to be more intelligent in the way he is using the energy, it's probably a huge area of cooperation. But there are also others, such as at the more global level. How do you promote an energy strategy which is balanced, which is helping you to ensure the energy transition, where you will have winners and losers, and is very important. I think this is an area which is coming more and more in the forefront. Is a kind of social dimension of the democratization of the energy, because these things are moving so fast at the moment that well, utilities in Europe, for instance, the big companies have lost a lot of money in the last years because they have missed completely the changes. They are struggling, and of course they are struggling by asking the government to subsidize them, but this is of course not exactly the best interest of the consumer. So it is also important to accompany this movement. At the same time, you have a lot of new entrants, and you have also a phenomenon which is surely worrying and which I think exists already in US and maybe in Canada, is the decentralization of production of energy is leading a number of communities just to consider that they could be completely autarcic. And then they would disconnect from the networks.
Grid.
And that means that the networks have been paid by all the consumers. And if some are saying, well, we do not pay tomorrow the networks fees, it will raise big problems and a welfare problem. So this is an issue which is also very important at the moment. And so we have a big debate at the moment in Europe on the way the electricity system should evolve, and the Commission should come with a major initiative, legislative initiative before the end of the year on the electricity market design, which is a way to ensure that renewables will enter the system without destabilizing the system. That the demand-side management will be empowered, and that also the networks will be saved, also because at the EU level we see that the optimization of the system relies on the interconnections. So in other words, that there should be a kind of solidarity between the member states. Some member states have very good things and some less good things. And if they may share their strengths to mitigate their weaknesses, that's really the aim of the Energy Union, which is the big project which is promoted at the moment in the EU. So on all these issues, there is room for sharing experience with Canada. And in innovation, then also for sure, CCS, I think Canada is today probably one of the leaders in CCS.
Carbon capture and storage.
Carbon capture and storage is very, very important. So this is clearly an area where we are looking for breakthrough. And in the last years, we've been disappointed. We've spent a lot of money in this area, but it seems
so is the Premier of Saskatchewan.
Yeah. And then, of course, it's carbon taxation and ETS, emission trading scheme, which is today a disaster to a certain extent, and which is also linked with the energy strategy. Some say the price of carbon has been completely undermined by the other objectives you have set, such as promotion of renewables with subsidies and promotion of energy efficiency. And that way you have reduced, of course, the value of the carbon to be saved. And you know, we have always expected a price of at least 30 euros per ton of CO2. Today, it is 6. So this is absolutely not playing as an incentive for innovation, for new technologies, and it is even paving the way for coal coming back. And that is, of course, not good at all. So there we have surely to share. Maybe a carbon tax is better, because now we are speaking about a carbon, a floor price for the ETS system, like UK decided already. So there are in this area a lot of things to be discussed. So you see plenty of subjects to be discussed.
So you've had a difficult experience with cap and trade or emissions trading systems. We have different jurisdictions that have different interests. BC has a carbon tax. Ontario and Quebec want to go the path of cap and trade. And there is now discussions internationally about carbon pricing. Will they eventually have to go towards the same level? Will there eventually have to be common cooperation in that kind of mechanism, Mr. Chapuis?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
The same burden internationally?
No, I think if you talk to business and banks and insurance companies, they are already anticipating a floor carbon price, which should be around $30 US a ton to $180 a ton, which is the Norwegian price, which is the highest price.
So can
the crisis of oil prices today doesn't help.
No.
Okay? And like Jean-Arnold was saying, I mean, we are in a situation today where there's a lot of confusion on the matter. But the idea that, without getting into the technicalities that nobody really understands, try to explain the ETS system to a normal citizen. He just cannot get it. In comparison, by benchmarking, the Vancouver system is clear. You know, neutral, carbon tax, you take on one end, you redistribute with the other. It's rather simple. But it has to make sense economically, and it has to make sense to the business. Now, if you allow me 2 seconds, one is, what do the businesses and the banks think about it? They want it, because they know today that it is hidden in the decisions. So they need the governments to get their act together, to be responsible, and to show what they have in the deck. So show me the price. And so that we can compete globally, internationally, with China, the US, and so on. With two, that means that governments, and even in Canada, I mean, it was clear in Vancouver, carbon pricing has to be discussed. And I was interested to hear Mr. Fass say that it has to be part of a set of tools, as you say. It's one of the tools. Because it will help to build, to empower there's no pun on it, the North American energy strategy that natural resources ministers have been discussing for a while now. And it's clear that when you are Canada and you export so much energy to the US, you need to have a global market and a global carbon pricing. You cannot be alone in BC or Quebec deciding I'm going to do that. No, it has to be integrated in order to be efficient. And third, ask the SMEs today, or the innovators, and the labs who are working on fuel cells, on nuclear fusion, on wind, solar, and also now sea power. There's a French experiment in Nova Scotia right now, which is quite interesting, to find all this new investment. And to show to the public opinion, each government, that's how they will get to carbon pricing. That if they get the mix right, then they will create the jobs that everybody is expecting in the new economy, digital and clean tech. And there's the sense that we have missed a few trains already. We are late at boarding. Look at what China has been investing in clean tech over the last 10 years. In solar, they are now number one. And we have had a problem in Europe when the Chinese solar companies almost killed the German market. So we have missed these trains because, you know, China was the bad guy and so on. And no, they were subsidizing, clearly, the SMEs to do that. And today, the questions we have in Europe, and I find the same question in Canada, and that's how we can work together if we bring the same answers to the companies, especially the small and medium companies, is to say, okay, if you are investing in fuel cells, electric cars, light train, infrastructure, you know, construction, the materials you're using brings energy efficiency and so on, and you're going to spend so much money in Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, and so on, that this is a possibility that we will grant you access to public markets. You know, transport, mass transit. The SMEs need that to grow. So if we can bring company alliances which are based on innovation, on structured research that we are already doing among universities and labs between Canada and Europe, if, like I've told all universities in Canada, please apply to Horizon 2020 for funds on energy transition research, then I think Europe and Canada can really be the leaders we hope to become.
How much of that is businesses and universities working together of their own accord, and how much is policy?
Well, I think there's a lot of that happening already. You can go beyond Max Planck and Helmholtz and Fraunhofer, these institutes that are renowned around the world. There are many other institutes, lesser known institutes, that are working on partnerships within Canada with many of our universities. And a lot of that work has to do with technology, has to do with environment. But just go back to Ambassador Chapuis' remark about companies having to understand the role they have to play in providing their own leadership. Even in Canada, we have organizations like the Mining Association of Canada, Forest Products Association of Canada, who've all come out and said, we support carbon pricing as part of a toolkit, but there's also a note of caution. The carbon pricing they're talking about has to be revenue neutral. They've made that very clear when you look at their statements. And their fear is that the government will overreach. I happen to be someone who does not believe that governments make particularly great decisions when it comes to picking winners and losers. And if a carbon pricing model in Canada or elsewhere around the world eventually becomes simply another tax grab that allows governments to make political decisions about where that money is spent, as opposed to making decisions based on the science and clear, achievable targets that are driving investments, I think then you're going to have a lot of public skepticism. And that's why in British Columbia, I'm from British Columbia, so I know of what I speak. When the carbon tax was implemented, it was actually implemented with very little fanfare or very little real opposition. Yeah, there were naysayers who said this is going to end up becoming another government tax grab. It actually has not done so, and it's my understanding that actually the government of British Columbia brings in about $100 million less of revenue on the carbon tax than it actually reduced individual and business taxes within British Columbia. So the challenge is to find the appropriate balance, because you have to keep the public on side. Public has to understand what you're doing, and they have to understand and accept your bona fides. And if you miss that balance and the public loses its trust, you will, as a government, very soon lose political capital to be able to govern and to be able to implement the kinds of policies that are actually going to achieve the commitments that we've made internationally. So it's a fine line, but I believe there is a way that can be achieved. It's being done, and I think all of us are learning from each other. That's the beautiful dynamic about this discussion and about the climate change file more broadly speaking. This is an incredibly dynamic learning experience for all the players around the globe. And all of us, it's not only going to be Canada that has to play a leadership role, it has to be everyone.
There's two different factors that you mentioned there. One is tax burden, the overall level of tax, and one is picking winners and losers. Certainly that seems to have been part of the problem with the emissions trading system in Europe, that there were so many exceptions that the price never got above a certain level. Has that affected the level of confidence in emissions trading and in the whole idea of carbon pricing?
Yes, definitely. ETS has been criticized by mostly all the people, because those expecting a price who would be incentivizing the investments in new technologies and clean technologies have been disappointed. And so there is, of course, a lot of ambiguity also on the side of industry. Industry is at the same time demanding and at the same time rejecting. So the level today, they support it at this level because it doesn't cost anything for them. So that is a bit a vicious situation in which we are at the moment. We are trying to correct the system with proposals which are being discussed at the moment in the European Parliament and the Council to ensure that the price will go up steadily after 2020. But the confidence to a certain extent has been eroded. And so we are still in a discussion in the energy sector about subsidies subsidies for renewables have been too generous and have helped the Chinese to build their solar industry, by the way, like the Americans have done. Also, they have helped the Chinese to build that. We don't want them now to build their wind industry on the basis of subsidies we have in Europe. And in any case, the subsidies have been costly, but I think they have demonstrated that renewables can be deployed at a price which is a market price. And this demonstration has been done. So that's, I would say, the benefit of the excessive subsidies which have been given. So consider that it was not a good idea, but at the end the result is good because now really wind onshore is completely in the market and solar also, which is the good news. And that means that today, I think many investments are going in the renewables, not only in Europe, but also you see that worldwide. So there was recently a report by UNEP, so the UN agency, environmental agency, showing that today the biggest investments in electricity are in the field of renewables. So this is showing that the energy transition is going on. And that has, of course, another consequence which is necessary to discuss, is, of course, the role of fossil fuel in the next 20, 30 years, because these are really in jeopardy. So there is a lot of gas now in the world, and some fear that this gas will stay underground. So if you see the consumption of gas in the EU, it has gone down from 550 BCM, billion cubic meters in 2010 to 400 last year. So it's a huge reduction due to energy efficiency, due to renewables in the electricity and so on. So there is, of course, also an issue there to look at, which is how you will manage this transition properly with a balance between the fossil fuel and the cleanest is gas. So clearly the aim is to eliminate coal as fast as possible. And in the field of oil, you see that it's transport, which is the issue, and that is the electrification of vehicles. But of course, electrification has not to be done with coal. So you still need to manage all this. So as you see, it's very difficult, very slow. A lot of subsidies are still injected in fossil fuel, in renewable, and sometimes in other things. We have capacity remuneration mechanisms now in the EU, which is the result of too much renewable in the system and making gas-fired power plants non-profitable. So there is some member states are under pressure from their main producers to subsidize just the maintenance of power plants just to stay there in case of problems. And this is, of course, a very, very costly policy, which is at the moment done at the national level, and that the Commission is trying to discipline completely to say, okay, if you want to do that, you take a region. So you take 5, 6 countries together to see whether they cannot help each other and avoiding to maintain power plants just there in case of problems and to pay for that. So there are a lot of issues there to look at. Hence, as you say, Ed, the question is really to find the right balance between all the interests and maintaining the objectives, which have to be clear. That is a low-carbon economy, I think. And of course, there is a big elephant in the room, which is carbon capture and storage. And I think for Canada, it's absolutely vital because you have a lot of fossil fuel. If you wish to maintain a value to your fossil fuel resources, I think there must be a solution to decarbonize these fossil fuels. And this is, I think, the big issue. And if you see that any investment in this area is for 30 or 40 years, there is some urgency to intervene. In Europe, and I want to add this information, which is interesting, there is a hidden price of carbon, and I think it's correct. For instance, the European Investment Bank is refusing any loan to a project of power generation which is emitting more than 550 grams per kilowatt. And this is killing coal, for sure. And this is followed by a number of commercial banks now. And I think this is becoming a kind of price of carbon which is now in the financial system.
We've talked a lot about climate change. You had mentioned earlier questions about Europe's security of energy supply and its diversity of energy supply. We haven't talked about that in terms of Canada. There is a concern in Europe about its main energy supplier and its the political relations with Russia and the rest of Europe. Does Canada really have a role to play in terms of energy cooperation with the European Union? Can we get the energy off the continent and to the EU? Mr. Wilkinson, you want to try a shot?
Just say yes.
It's a pretty broad question.
Bring it to St. John.
Yeah, it's a pretty broad question. I think that that there's a whole number of ways in which Canada can, I think, contribute from an energy security perspective. Some of them relate to some of the topics that you were just talking about. I mean, issues around clean tech, particularly around CCS, could have a significant impact on the way in which you think about existing resources within Europe. You know, the whole discussion around LNG in Canada as well as oil pipelines are obviously relevant to that. Although as Europe moves down the path towards, you know, further decarbonization, you're probably more likely to be focused on LNG than you are on oil. So I think that there's interesting opportunities for conversations, but you know they can be pretty broad. You know, I mean, the other idea that folks have talked a little bit about is that there are new forms of energy generation that are probably 20 years from being commercial, but are being worked on extensively both in Europe and in Canada. So things like fusion, where there's a big European ITA which is doing it, but there's also a lot of work going on in Canada. There's some real, I think, opportunities to figure out if there's ways in which we can collaborate rather than to actually work on such an enormously costly program separately.
Now, before we open it up to questions from the audience, I did want to ask about cooperation internationally between Canada and the European Union. We talked about work together with developing countries in various ways, mitigation. Now that we seem to be on the same tune, same wavelength diplomatically, is there an increased opportunity for that, especially with new levels of funding that have been announced for developing countries, Mr. Chapuis?
I think there has always been a European interest to engage Canada on these issues. And it seems to me today that the last few months, there's a reflection on the way international development policies are going to be constructed in this new administration, and that if they have choices to be made, because, you know, we cannot finance everything, geographically, Latin America and Africa are clearly the two continents where Canada is looking closely at. And because of security issues also, West Africa is of interest to Canada. And the best way to fight terrorism is to bring development. Once you have finished the war, it's not finished. I mean, you need to root up the reasons why the war started. And I think, and we are seeing that in the Sherpa meetings for the G7 or the G20, we are seeing that our Canadians diplomats are talking to us everywhere in the world in preparing for the humanitarian summit in Istanbul this month and the Habitat 3 conference in Quito this fall, that there is an interest to engage a discussion on how we link our climate change strategy, our energy policies, our investment in new technologies with development. And we are welcoming that, of course. I think all of Europe welcomes that, especially in the places where donors have been less visible than before. Everybody is flocking to the emerging countries, but in the Sahelian region, there are not so many people around. So if Canada wants to engage into these discussions, it's more than, I mean, Europe and the Commission, I think, and France in particular will be most welcoming it.
That's something that the Prime Minister had put quite a bit of emphasis on before he arrived in Paris. He announced new funding for mitigation in developing countries. Is that an area for cooperation with the European Union?
I think it absolutely is. I mean, I think we have some very common perspectives in terms of the need to look to find ways to enable developing countries to develop in a lower carbon manner than what we did. I think, we all recognize also the humanitarian requirement that we address some of the issues around adaptation that are going to be faced by, many, many smaller nations around the world. And I think finally, I think we recognize, and I think Europe recognizes, that there are some significant opportunities economically that will come from participating in helping some of these developing countries to actually develop their grid infrastructures and to develop the kinds of or not grid infrastructures, their distributed energy networks, in a manner that will actually enable them to both develop economically, but also to do that in a low carbon way. That would be a significant benefit to a lot of the companies that are, we're looking to sort of drive in terms of clean tech.
I mean, Canadian companies get an entree into markets.
Absolutely.
We'd like to take some questions. If there's anyone who wants to pose a question, please don't be shy. If you would line up, I think there's going to be microphones on either side, and we need somebody to go first. Anyone? All right.
Thank you very much. My name's Una Fitzgerald. I'm with the Center for International Governance Innovation. Thank you very much for a very interesting panel. I was interested in this whole question of having a carbon tax that is also neutral. And so I have questions about whether carbon tax adjustments, which are consistent with WTO, could be useful in that regard. And I also had a question, how do we get to a common global standard price for carbon? Is this something that Canada and the EU could do together to show leadership in that respect? And I have another question, if you could get to it. It's just, you were all a bit skeptical about carbon capture and sequestration. So if you could perhaps explain that a little bit more so we can see whether that is a viable option. Thank you.
Okay. You go for the WTO question, Mr.
Go for the WTO. Anything we do, of course, in terms of establishing policy, whether it's on carbon pricing or other environmental policies, those initiatives always have to be in compliance with our World Trade Organization obligations and our trade obligations with countries we have free trade agreements with. And we've seen some challenges with that in Canada when provinces have tried to apply environmental safeguards or make decisions based on what they believe is in the best interests environmentally for their province, that there can be challenges at the World Trade Organization or under NAFTA Chapter 11 or under any other dispute settlement chapter in our free trade agreements. So you have to be very, very careful. Where this will play a role, I believe, is when you implement a carbon pricing regime, you also want to make sure that your carbon-intensive, trade-sensitive industries are treated fairly. You know, one of the challenges we have in Canada, what we don't want to do is see industries disappear because we've tilted the playing field against them. Our biggest competitor is, of course, to the south. And so there's been discussions between our former government as well as the new government on making sure that we align our approaches to addressing the challenges of greenhouse gas emissions and other emissions for that matter. And so we want to make sure that as we implement these policies, we're treating our trade-sensitive and our carbon-intensive industries fairly. And when we do that...
Carve-outs? Carve-outs for those industries?
Well, I'm not suggesting necessarily carve-outs, although that is one model that could be followed. But every time you do that, say you impose some kind of a restriction against balance things for our companies, there's always a risk that you're going to violate commitments at the WTO or elsewhere in your free trade agreements. So that's the caveat I would place on that. You want to make sure that any carbon pricing regime is done within a broader context. And I think there still has to be a lot of discussion at the international level, at the bilateral level, the degree to which countries can actually go to balance the playing field for companies that are now going to be paying some kind of carbon price, which would put them at a disadvantage vis-a-vis their international competitors.
So part of I think the second question was, how could Canada and the European Union, for example, go about establishing or working towards some kind of common carbon price mechanism? And I guess the question of carbon price adjustments plays into that, because if you've got two continents, or a country and a continent, working on common carbon price, they would probably want to have some kind of rule for other products that enter from the outside. In other words, to do some kinds of adjustments at its borders. But is there a way to work towards Canada and the EU? I mean, we're talking about a few years away.
But it is happening already right now in the preparation of the Marrakesh COP22, where carbon pricing will be one of the main topics, world carbon price. I don't believe we'll see something like a World Council or a board on carbon pricing somewhere, that will be have executive powers to determine the price of carbon. But in New York, when you read all the statements that were made during the signature ceremony, it was very interesting to see that all the leaders that in their interviews or when Justin Trudeau talked at the podium at the UN, that was only 22nd of April, so that was 2 weeks ago, that the common thread was carbon pricing.
But it's very hard to determine what the price is.
How it should be and so on. Yes, but that's why we have experts, But basically, I think, like Mr. Fast was saying, the companies, or Mr. Lanois was mentioning, he's referring to, in fact, the companies know what the price is today, more or less, in somewhere around $50, somewhere around that. And it's going to change, of course. The question is, you want a system which has to be as neutral as possible in terms of revenue, but basically, most importantly, which will be the signal for all the financial institutions and the big companies to say, okay, we decarbonize our portfolios and we invest in the new economy, because that's where the jobs are. That's why we need that carbon pricing. Why do we need it?
But across borders,
across the board, and China has been positive on that idea because it is hosting. It is the factory of the world. It is hosting. 50% of the multinationals are today located and working in China.
So we have a government trying to put provinces together and agree on mechanisms for carbon pricing within Canada, and that will be done by presumably sort of political agreement. This is the way it would work internationally?
Like it's already doing, BC, Quebec, Ontario. There could be a deal between Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Everything is possible.
But when you actually look at how difficult it is within Canada to get the provinces and territories to agree, firstly, on a carbon pricing regime, a national one, and secondly, on what the minimum price for carbon would be, how difficult that is. Think of the difficulty of doing that internationally. I think it's still a ways away, but I agree that the place to do that is going to be at COP. Whether it's COP 22, 25, 30, that is the forum in which these kinds of decisions have to be made. And again, I'll go back to leadership. I think it's going to take leadership from some of the developed countries to actually do this on their own, establish national minimum carbon standards, and then hopefully that morphs into something greater at the multilateral level.
Can I agree actually with a lot of what Ed just said, but can I touch on the CCS question?
Sure.
So, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, and I wouldn't want to leave you with the impression that certainly I'm negative on carbon capture and storage. I think that there are some challenges, and I think that there's quite a lot of work going on in Canada on carbon capture and storage, and there's a fair bit of work going on in the United States as well. The government of Saskatchewan has made a significant investment in carbon capture. The challenge with that technology, now that it seems to be working relatively well, is one of cost. Ultimately, the cost per ton, effective cost per ton, needs to be something that actually is viable. And the technology there is actually relatively conventional technology, just at a much larger scale. And what they're going to need to do is figure out how you actually reduce the cost of that to make it competitive. There are other technologies that are also being developed, though. There's a company in Burnaby, BC called Inventus that's working with Husky with a very novel technology. And so their challenge is less cost, and it's more about showing that it actually will work and that it will actually work at scale. So I'm not negative at all, but I think there are challenges that need to be worked through. We're not 2 years away from having a commercial system, but I think that it's certainly very interesting at this stage. I think that there's a lot of promise. And there's a lot of promise, to be honest with you, with other technologies that are not actually CCS, but are carbon capture direct from air, like carbon engineering, and direct from water, which in some ways is easier than air because you have a higher concentration of CO2. So there's lots of that kind of work going on. I think we just need to be realistic about what are the hurdles that need to get over, and we need to make sure that we're watching as they progress.
Do we have another question from the audience?
Thank you. I want to get to a question that was raised at the very end, but I felt that needed a bit of elaboration. The question regarding mitigation. So, Foreign Minister Dion several weeks ago announces that there's going to be a major initiative linking conflict to drought and trying to find solutions to that particular problem that has arisen in the Middle East, Syria being a case in point. The evidence is fairly strong, suggesting that that conflict is in large part traceable back to drought conditions that preceded the conflict several years. So we now are experiencing drought in Ethiopia and sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of what you've talked about is 30, 40 years out of reach. Maybe we won't be experiencing the kinds of climate change as a result of these policies, but we need to be thinking about acting now in regards to mitigation and prevention. So I'm just wondering, if the panelists have any thoughts on specifically what the EU and Canada can do regarding dealing with drought conditions that are destabilizing countries, and the evidence is now fairly overwhelming. They are contributing to conflict in these countries as well.
I'd be wary about drawing a connection or a nexus, a link between climate change and the conflict within the Middle East. That is a complex conflict with many different aspects to it. I think that's all I'll say.
Yes, 1 year ago the discussion was not possible. Today it is happening in many conferences, the link between climate change, severe drought, and what we call now climate refugees. We're seeing them in northern Ethiopia right now, massive migrations. We have seen that in the Sahelian region, and there is sound science today to explain that not all the Syrian crisis, but a considerable part, and the absence of political governance to it, was the drought in Syria that happened a few years ago. What can we do? That's what the question. What can we do?
In the short term?
In the short term. First, we need to get the Paris Agreement implemented. The way to find droughts, severe climatic events, is to stop the vector of temperatures, rising temperatures. And this vector, as you know very well, is going to 5 and 6. The INDCs, the way the governments have promised in Paris, go to 3. We have pledged to go to 2.5, to 2, and if possible, 1.5. So we need to revise our INDCs in the next 5 years to go to that target. But we are far from it. So the first thing we can do is multilaterally keep the momentum of Paris, ratify the agreement. We've seen that the cabinet has just tabled the agreement in Parliament. This is very good news. It gives a clear signal to everybody. Second, in Marrakesh, we need to do something specific on Africa, where the droughts are the most severe, especially Sahelian and the Horn of Africa. I think there should be concrete projects decided in Marrakesh. That's what the High Ambition Group is trying to do. And we need also to talk about access to water. We didn't have the time to do that in Paris, you may remember, but NGOs were pressuring everybody to say, but what about water? Access to water and power generation to get access to water, irrigation systems and so on. So we need to talk about that soon. And third, we need to have a kind of climate task force. But almost all, the governments are already doing that in many ways. Europe is doing through ECO to that humanitarian aid today, and it will be clear, that will be mentioned in Istanbul. Humanitarian aid today talks about migration, and within the migration issues, talks about climate migration.
So mitigation is stopping, really, reducing the climate change first, but those projects that you're talking about don't sound particularly short-term, the ones that are going to become at Marrakesh. And dealing with droughts is not something you can mitigate very simply, is it?
It's not Harry Potter, it's not magic, but it can be done. Other countries have done it. It can be done. But you have drought in Africa like you have drought in California or in the Canadian prairies. After, it's all a question of density of population and the migration flows that are due to that. But we can probably, it is our belief in terms of developmental diplomacy, we Europeans think that we can deliver these solutions in a quicker way than before. We need to focus and to create the diplomatic alliances that are necessary to do so.
Right. Is there another question from the floor? Aha.
Thank you. Richard Cohen. Monsieur Vinois mentioned the elephant in the room as being carbon capture. There's another elephant in the room which I don't think has been mentioned at all by any of you up there today, and that's nuclear power. I'd be interested to hear your views on the role of nuclear power in reducing greenhouse gases. France, of course, is a leader in civil nuclear power, and I presume that one of the reasons why France has taken the lead in reducing greenhouse gases is because it's in a very advantageous position by virtue of the fact that a very high percentage of energy requirements in France is produced by nuclear power. Canada also has a lot of history and excellent technology, perhaps to export, not only to the European Union countries, but certainly to other countries in terms of nuclear power. And yet nuclear power, of course, is a very sensitive issue. It has its own problems. But I'd be interested to hear your views on what role nuclear power could play in reducing greenhouse gases and reducing climate change.
So should we start with Mr. Vinois? You probably have a European perspective with different countries in mind.
Well, there is no European perspective in nuclear because there is a complete disagreement among the member states on nuclear. So half of the member states are in favor and the other half is against. The best example is that when there was a decision by UK to build a new power plant, this has been attacked by Austria and Ireland, I think, so, which have no nuclear industry. And so there is no view at the European level on nuclear, although there is some budget allocated for nuclear research, not least the ITER, the fusion, which has been mentioned, but also for more conventional. And so, you know, in the recent years after Fukushima, Germany has decided to stop completely nuclear power plants by 2022. Belgium has decided to finish also by 2025. Switzerland also decided to stop. And so I think that the public acceptance in the EU about nuclear is very low. I think the only country which is really a very strong supporter is France. But if you see the problems that EDF and Areva have in the recent years, it is due to new buildings which are facing major problems and major cost escalations. And there are now a lot of questions about decommissioning nuclear power plants and waste management, where the costs are absolutely opaque and for which the provisions have not been probably made properly, leaving probably a kind of major problem for the next 10 years or 20 years for paying that. So I think in Europe there is a lot of skepticism about it. There are no new buildings, except the Russians are building, intending to build in Finland and in Hungary. And the Chinese also will be associated with the French in Britain. But this project has been delayed already 2 or 3 times. So I think that the only one who are promising in the field of nuclear is the Chinese, because they have the intention to have a very long series of 50 or 60 reactors, which will enable them to really compress the prices. The Russians, I don't know really about the number of questions there, which are about security and things like that. So what's happening in Russia today is not always very clear. So all in all, and if you see the forecast of the International Energy Agency, nuclear will be stable in the next 10 years and due to probably to decrease in after that. So, and that is of course surely due to Fukushima. I think that after Chernobyl and then Fukushima, but Fukushima particularly happening in Japan, in the developed country, it has really made a major problem. So. Of course, otherwise nuclear is CO2 neutral or close to be neutral. So apparently it's good. But at the moment I see more the energy efficiency and the renewables being much more publicly accepted as policies to decarbonize the energy system.
It was once a Canadian trade priority, selling nuclear technology around the world. It's not so much anymore, is it?
Well, if you talk to the people that are still doing it, they would say it's a high priority. I know that CANDU technology is still being promoted to China because it has some unique characteristics. Can use thorium, as you know. Same thing with reusing spent fuel rods. There's some opportunities there to complement what the Chinese are doing. I understood that Romania is still looking at a project that would involve a Chinese-Canadian joint partnership on a build, because I believe some of the infrastructure is already in place there. But it's certainly not a bright future for the industry unless something fundamental changes. In Canada, we have no new builds planned, whether in Ontario or New Brunswick. There's nothing.
There's 2 politicians on the panel. Is there much of a public support for the idea of nuclear taking the place of some of the energy inventory, or taking a large place of some of the energy inventory in Canada, do you think?
Well, I don't think there is domestically, but that's partly because of the nature of the energy mix in Canada. I mean, you know, if you look at what we've got, I mean, we're about 20% that's hydrocarbon based, right? I mean, the only coal plants in Canada are in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Nova Scotia. So the need for additional large-scale nuclear from a domestic perspective is pretty limited. I think that, you know, we do see this as a legitimate form of greenhouse gas-friendly energy from a base load perspective, from a, you know, in terms of marketing internationally. There clearly are concerns around nuclear, particularly around waste and decommissioning. But I think it remains a legitimate option in the context of moving to a lower carbon economy, particularly in areas like China, where you really are going to look at displacing large volumes of coal. The whole debate around nuclear obviously would change significantly if we actually ended up seeing nuclear fusion technology that worked. You know, the whole thing goes away at that point. But I think at this stage, I don't think it's a highest priority. You know, and I think it's kind of what Ed was saying, which is, We continue to market in areas where we actually think it can have benefits from a GHG perspective, but I don't think from a domestic perspective there's really a demand for that here.
Is there one last question before we Colin Roberts?
Thanks, Campbell. My question, it sort of pick up what you've just talked about, and that is that, and I particularly put my question to the Canadians, don't you think we're particularly in a country like Canada, where we are a federation, the provinces do have responsibility for resources, which big role that is energy, is that we're better to let the sort of variation on a theme, even when it comes to carbon pricing, where you have a tax in British Columbia, a levy in Alberta, cap and trade in Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec. You talked about carbon capture and storage in Saskatchewan. We've got this great variation. I think we sometimes try to put ourselves in a pretzel. If you have a kind of a, say, well, this must be it across the board, especially when a country is diverse with different types of energy resources, and you've just sort of captured it when you talked about Europe, where you said the French depend on nuclear, and worth reminding, half the electricity in this province comes from nuclear. So, don't you think, in a sense, if you should be focusing on the end result rather than how you do it?
I think that's exactly what we are doing. I mean, if you listen to the conversation around the federal-provincial process, we're very much focused on outcomes, and that being that there is a carbon price across the country. If we were starting from a blank sheet, would it be ideal for us to actually be dealing with this in a similar manner across the country? Yeah, it would be. But we're not starting from a blank sheet. There are a number of provinces who have led in this regard, British Columbia being one. And I think that we need to take that into account in the context of the conversations with the provinces. In Canada, I mean, people will know, but I mean, there are separate constitutional jurisdictions. We require the provinces to work with us to develop an effective climate change strategy. And so that means we need to take into account the perspectives and the interests of the provinces as well. I think that it would be counterproductive for us to simply try to simply impose something on the provinces. And having been a federal provincial negotiator myself in the past for one of Canada's provinces, I think that kind of approach is doomed to failure. So we're working on outputs and ensuring that we actually do have a carbon price across the country, but that may mean that there are differences in its implementation in different provinces.
Lawrence, I think we're agreeing too much, the two of us.
Would you care to fight over this a bit?
No. Given the fact that the new government has actually made a very clear commitment to a new cooperative federalism, I think it's almost impossible for them to try to impose a one-size-fits-all plan on Canada. Because, you have a wide diversity of views where this should go. You look at the 3 northern territories and they're saying, hey, no carbon pricing for us, we just can't afford it. We're a diesel-dependent economy, diesel-dependent community, and you're going to decimate us if you impose any kind of carbon pricing. You have many of the other premiers that have already committed their provinces to some type of carbon pricing. You've got some that are planning, or they're at least open to the discussion. My concern is this. Once you impose a national plan that presumably has reasonable take-up from the provinces, you're also going to have situations where you have some bad experiences and some positive experiences. Down the road, there's going to have to be some kind of a reconciliation. If one solution is not working for that province, and it's costing that province dearly, if it's costing the federal government dearly, there's going to have to be some kind of adjustment that takes place. But that's in the future. Right now, I think the government's plan is to come up with this national climate change plan, which we've been waiting for a long time.
All right, well, I said that was the last question, and I'll keep true to my word. I'd like to invite you all to thank the panel with me.